more different kinds of websites used. Search is the real big one, and search is important because it makes a huge difference to business. Really, if people can search and check prices, check availability, it means that if a business really is only surviving because nobody knows any better, it's got a short life. So search is really important, email is important. And the other area is mostly probably, everything's online, but the big ones are community and messaging sites. So that's now sitting at about 70% of people engaging with those. And you know, that's a 12-month rolling average, it's spiking like that. So today, it'll be even higher than that. So, you know, we have to sort of move on from saying, look, I'm not going to do the Facebook thing, I'm not going to do that thing, because the answer is you'll kind of end up doing something or you'll be left behind. And particularly in business, if you're not engaging with those things, they're happening, you're just not there. So this is all really seriously happening. Facebook at almost 60%. Twitter, which I didn't think was going to take off. You know, I'm probably in that not early adopter stage, but I look at things and think, well, what's the value? What's it going to do for me? And I couldn't see any value in Twitter. It sat there for a while, but now it's taken off. It's running about, it was sitting at 7% in Australia, it's running at about 13% now, and becoming much more of a political and business tool rather than just a fun tool. And if we thought that people weren't going to start buying on the internet, we were wrong again. It's now the majority of people in New Zealand have bought something on the internet, and consistently, once you've done it, you'll do it again. So buying on the internet is happening. It's going to make a huge difference to organisations. There'll have to be, or organisations will have to engage with the internet in one form or another, or have a very particularly niche product. I'll just go quickly through this. This is about unemployment, and as I said, the Roy Morgan unemployment figure, which is the red one, is putting New Zealand unemployment at just under 10%, 9.7. The New Zealand government stats have it at about 6.2. They don't track perfectly. There's a bit of a correlation, but they don't track perfectly. And we can see that in Australia, unemployment is skyrocketing, and in fact has taken over, is higher than in New Zealand. And the key thing about unemployment is it hits the young first and hardest, and it also hits people who are unskilled, who don't have sort of skills or experience. So if you're young and you don't have an education, you're going to get that double whammy. And you know, that's just one of the key areas that why unemployment is so damaging. Apart from the unemployment estimate, I think it's very important to look at just the proportion of the population employed, because that's all about the number of people that can be spending and the number of people who are actually being productive in the workplace. So what we see here for New Zealand is that about a decade ago, it was running at about 65% of the New Zealand population were in employment. It's now down, it's lower. It's now at about 63.6, 64%. So it increased, proportion increased, and then it's come down, and it's landed lower than a decade ago. In Australia, the proportion that are employed and engaged is number one, lower than New Zealand, but it's continually increasing. These are pretty important numbers. And the other important number, this is happening in both Australia and New Zealand, is that there's an increase in part-time work at the expense of full-time work. So even though we're measuring this thing, what proportion is employed, if people are employed in part-time work, it's less productivity. And you've also got an increased number of people who are what we call underemployed. So they have part-time work, but they really wish they had full-time work. They want more hours, so they're underemployed. So these are numbers that it's really quite important to just be tracking to have a sense of where the nation's going. Incomes have obviously increased in New Zealand over the last decade, but they haven't kept up with Australian incomes by any standard, even taking no account of the value of the dollar. Consumer confidence, you can see tracked here over time. Global financial crisis that really crashed, came up again, and I would say New Zealanders overall are a relatively confident bunch, a relatively robust, confident group of people, and we're sitting at the latest number there at 119.2, as I mentioned earlier. why does consumer confidence matter? It's just not a number, so you say, oh terrific, we're confident, that's, you know, nice. The real reason it matters is that people who are confident buy more things, they do more things, they engage in more things, they're more likely to feel financially stable and therefore act that out, less worried about interest rates, less worried and cutting down spending. Confident people are the ones that engage. If you're looking to change, focus on the confident people. If you're looking to sell things to people, focus on the confident people. So really important to be tracking not only overall changes in confidence, but to be able to target where the confident people are, because they are the ones that are able to be marshalled to do almost anything. Household wealth. When you see these charts, you realise that in fact things are just charging on ahead, aren't they? So household wealth is now at about 1.1 trillion in New Zealand. It's been kind of about there for that last little while after a big increase. But it's important to realise that when we look at debt, we actually see that debt is now about 15% of household wealth, whereas previously it was running at 18% of household wealth. So part of our sense, this is the case in New Zealand and Australia, part of our sense of tough times is actually our expectations are so much higher. So we have to build these kinds of things into our thinking. Mortgage stress correlates pretty strongly with interest rates. So what we're seeing is that mortgage stress is the people who are going to have difficulty paying their mortgage. It hit 1 in 3 in August 2008. Almost 1 in 3 people in New Zealand were under mortgage stress. Now it's around 17%. And the proportion of people that will find it difficult based on their income and what's coming into their household and their other expenses, just about 9% of people would find it difficult just to be even paying off the interest rate. So again, this is one of those things where interest rates affect people with mortgages negatively. They affect self-funded retirees positively. So there's swings and roundabouts in all of these areas. In terms of politics, there's two key things going on, I suppose, is fewer people are now seeing the government's doing a good job running the country, and slightly more people are now saying, I don't trust the New Zealand government. Now, this is interesting given that concerns about the economy are the top concern in New Zealand. There's no question about that. Everyone is looking at things through an economic lens. But it's come off. It's come off the boil. It's no longer this huge demanding issue. So you would think that the government wouldn't be under so much pressure. But I think essentially what we've got is we're not in an election period. You know, the people aren't, the government isn't out saying how terrific everything is. So people are falling back to this almost the sort of the midpoint. And we're also seeing in terms of vote the same pattern, coming back to the midpoint. So we've actually got, the National Party at 44 and Labor at 32. More close to the 2008 election than the 2010. So, what about Auckland and Wellington? We've said, first of all, that Auckland is younger, we've looked at that, and we've said that Auckland has a more sort of diverse population. So, country of birth, if we look at Auckland, we actually see, what do we see? 66.4% of people in Auckland were born in Auckland, whereas in Wellington it's 78.9%. So this means that you've got, 35%, 34% of people were not born in Auckland. A big chunk, and Wellington it's a much lower number. And if you look at the rest of New Zealand, people outside those main areas, it's very, very strongly New Zealand. And that correlates almost perfectly with, I feel like I'm a New Zealander. I consider myself to be a New Zealander. So that's strong identification with New Zealand. And similarly, Auckland has proportionally fewer Europeans. Auckland has more Pacific Islanders down here, more Maoris, more Indians, more Asians. So there's more of these people from other places and other sort of ethnic groups. So it's got to be seen as more culturally diverse and probably more cosmopolitan, although we can argue about what that means. and we will, no doubt. Education, briefly, I talked about the fact that Wellington and Auckland are both ahead in terms of the education stakes. We see the same in Australia. Capital cities more likely to have a better educated population than non-major cities. And what we see here is that Wellington is marginally ahead of Auckland in the education stakes. Public transport, we're seeing that in terms of bus, train, taxi, all of these things, Wellington's doing it more. Auckland are more likely to be driving, with the result that they're in Auckland, average kilometres driven a year is around 15,974, nearly 16,000. In Wellington it's much lower, just well under 15,000 k a year. So different situations, and you know it obviously relates to Auckland growing and simply more traffic, more cars, transport system hasn't kept up, all of those kinds of things, but it also relates to people and the choices they make. Owning and paying off homes is a really interesting one because it's a combination of age and affluence. So typically older people are more likely to have their own home that they've either bought or they're paying off. Younger people less likely to, and increasingly less likely to because they're going to be in school longer, they're choosing to travel overseas rather than settle down, and they're choosing to engage in things like technology and things that many years ago would have been seen as totally frivolous. They're making those choices rather than saving and getting into a home very, very early. So youth will have a lot to do with it as well. And I think the data really clearly shows outside Auckland and Wellington, the older areas, you've actually got higher levels of home ownership, followed by Wellington and then down in Auckland. So issues in Auckland which are being talked about in terms of the cost of housing, there's no question the cost of housing is increasing and there's more people and not enough houses to go around. But we mustn't forget that people make choices, and particularly younger people are increasingly choosing other than the decision to forego all other things so that they can own their own home and get into something really small and scale up. People do make choices. Socioeconomic status, we look at these things in terms of quintiles, the top quintile being the AB, and we can see very clearly Wellington, the red line, is a standout. So much higher levels of overall socioeconomic status. 30% of people in Wellington are in the top 20% of the nation. So much higher levels of affluence. Health problems, this was really interesting. So health problems generally correlate with age. As you get older, everything kind of breaks down. So you know, people who are older and areas outside Auckland and Wellington are bound to have problems with all sorts of things. But what was a surprise to me was to see, I'll come back to this, were to see lungs and breathing a problem in Wellington, skin, hair and nail problems, ear, nose and throat problems. It's kind of like a fresh air thing going on here that's not working that well. So that stood out. That was actually a surprise. So somebody here might know exactly why that is. Now I won't do this outside this room, but Wellington also seems to have more mental health problems and behavioural problems.
Connected with the beehive.
Politicians. I don't know. It's the same in Canberra. In fact, one of the things that's interesting, when I began this research, as an outsider, you don't begin so much with a clear sense of what you're going to find. I thought it would be very much like Canberra versus the rest of Australia. And when we did that analysis, I came up with the punchline, which is Canberra is like Disneyland. It is so removed from reality. Education levels are more than double the nation, really well educated compared to much lower levels of education. Affluence, triple. No unemployment in Canberra, massive unemployment elsewhere. On every dimension they were so much better. And totally disconnected, incredibly socially progressive compared to the rest of the nation. And I expected to see that here. And we don't see the same disconnect. We just don't. I mean, the differences that we're seeing, they're there, but they're nuances. Wellington is still part of New Zealand. there's no question, Wellington is still absolutely embedded in New Zealand. It's like Canberra really is Disneyland. People go in there, they do their job and they leave. It really is a fly-in, fly-out city. And the big problem for Australia with that is that you've actually got people making decisions about education when if they live in Canberra, their kids are going to fabulous schools. They can't conceive of children in schools that are just awful. So you're living in a world where everything's perfect and clean and tidy and fabulous, making rulings and policies for people that you just can't even begin to understand. Don't see anything like that kind of divide here. We see what you'd expect, a more affluent population, a more socially progressive, more worldly population, more sophisticated population, but not the huge disconnect that you see in Canberra. We'll forget the mental health and behavioural problems for the moment. So we talked about more progressive attitudes with Wellingtonians, and clearly it comes out strongly here. More progressive viewpoint, more attracted to new things, more into computers and technology, and 66% of people support homosexual couples being allowed to adopt children. So in a country that's already pretty socially progressive relative to the rest of the world, Wellington's even more so. And while we might feel proud of that, we may also realise we might be just a bit out of step. Conservative attitudes, the same sort of pattern emerges, that there's less of these conservative attitudes in Wellington. Now, general attitudes and values, it's really quite interesting what we're seeing here. I think probably Wellingtonians, people in Wellington are less likely to be worried about crime and less likely to be worried about corruption. So, crime here, corruption here. Less likely than people in Auckland to say a percentage of everyone's income should go to charities. They're the main sort of things. Some of these attitudes are very much city versus non-city, the broad conservative thing. But I think the crime and corruption differential between Auckland and Wellington may be a function of reality rather than the mindset of people. You would have a better view about that than I do. Work status, pretty important. We've got more people, we talked about more people in New Zealand employed as a proportion of the population than say in Australia. And in Wellington, there are proportionately more people employed. So just about 70% of people living in Wellington are actually employed ahead of the rest of the nation. This is a lot of data for one chart, and I'm very happy for people to have access to this. But the key thing that this is showing is that overall, in New Zealand overall, the proportion of people that are employed has trended down. Remember we saw that chart? And that's the same in Auckland, the rest of New Zealand, but in Wellington, it's actually picking up. So the proportion of people employed, which I'd have to say on any measure is a good thing, is on the increase in Wellington compared to the rest of the population. And the number of full-time workers has held. So it's not just the proportion employed is going up, but they're all in part-time work. The growth has come from part-time workers, but the full-time employment has held. So employment's looking more solid here than the rest of the world. The rest of the world, but the rest of New Zealand. I have to say, when I look at this chart of consumer confidence, we've actually got Wellington being the red line. The first thing that struck me is that there's not a great divergence. There really isn't. In Australia, we have major differentials. So in Australia, if we look at, say, Western Australia, consumer confidence compared to the rest is like that. They're poles apart. Canberra's way up here, the rest of the population's down here. So this is a very interesting chart. There's not the kind of divergence that we see. If we wanted to do the league ladder, you've got Auckland's consumer confidence has just pipped Wellington at the post for this last measure. But it's playing at the margins. There's a lot of consistency here. Now, attitude towards the economy. I think what's going on here, Wellingtonians are more financially stable, they're more affluent, they're more likely to be employed, and they're more likely to feel financially stable at the moment, themselves and for their family.